Thank you. And thank you so much, Professor Xiang, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure, and my colleague and I are so excited to be here and to hear all of your questions and criticisms about what we're working on. All right, so I'll try to keep it under an hour so there's plenty of time for questions. I'm very happy to take kind of questions of clarification if something went by a bit too quickly during the talk, but otherwise we'll save questions for the end. So I'm a political philosopher and philosopher of social science, and in particular I've been thinking a lot about AI and technology and how it's changing both the social sciences and our everyday lives. So this talk really comes out of a kind of interest in how AI is changing the economy, where a little bit of the talk is more from a kind of philosophy of social science perspective. So if that's what you're interested in, or a kind of social epistemology perspective, maybe the first section will be most interesting to you. And then it's a bit more kind of political philosophy. And in particular, what I'm interested in is whether more liberal Western theories in political philosophy can account for these moral complaints that workers have about technology. And I'm going to argue that we ought to make room for a kind of tradition more grounded in critical theory, social philosophy, that's thinking about the kind of epistemology of workers in the workplace and their ability to access and use information. All right. So AI is drastically, we know, reshaping the economy. So if you try to look for predictions about how AI is going to change the economy, you get a really wide swathe of predictions, some really pessimistic, some really optimistic. In part, we know how AI changes the economy will depend upon a bunch of social and institutional factors. But in any case, we already see a number of, I think, exciting and interesting applications. So in financial markets, for example, automated trading algorithms were responsible for more than 70% of trades on, for example, the US stock market in 2011, probably much, much higher by now. Why is this? Well, of course, an automated system can trade much faster than a human and often recognize patterns much better. So if you're you're trading on the stock market and you're looking to kind of buy things, make a profit very, very quickly, AI systems will do better than your human traders. We've seen what Shoshana Zuboff, a scholar at UNC, calls the rise of surveillance capitalism, as well as increasing automation. So she's arguing that in many capitalist economies, now many new business models are based on data. So now companies have incredible amounts of data about, for example, individual customers, what they buy, even maybe what you look at. So I've been told that every time we try to go into a shop, someone in China tells us, why are you going to look for that in a shop? You can order it online. You can just use an app and get what you want online, right? But of course, all these apps, Amazon, these websites have really minute, detailed information about what you click on, what you don't, what you search. So they can use this information in order to kind of build targeted advertisements or market products differently. We also see digitized sensors used in workplaces, as well as robots that are powered by these digitized sensors. And we see, as I mentioned, online markets. So recommendation and matching algorithms are changing markets for goods and services. Again, if you're using an app to buy things, often it will recommend products to you. It will rank products for you in terms of relevance. And often people are finding work via, at least in many countries, these kind of market for tasks. So for example, in India, some sociologists have charted how people there will work for Amazon on Mechanical Turk, doing tasks that they kind of find individually. And so often, rather than work for a traditional company, people are just competing for tasks via these platforms. So we see, and this was the title of the talk, the rise of something we might want to call algorithmic management, and this is what I'll focus on today. So algorithmic management is the continuous monitoring of workers and accompanied use of algorithms to evaluate worker behavior. So this is really ubiquitous in many companies around the world. I've chosen just one example, the example of Amazon. So we have two people in this picture that are putting Amazon packages on a loader. So in Amazon warehouses, often you have to wear some kind of badge which tracks your physical movements. It uploads those data in real time, and these data are all computed in order to figure out, for example, are you meeting your package targets efficiently? Are you not meeting your package targets? Have you taken too long of a toilet break, for example? And it allows managers to set very, very detailed requirements for what workers have to do in the workplace, like the requirement of every hour, say, or maybe every 3 hours, you can only have 2 minutes for a toilet break. And they can actually observe worker behavior and enforce this. Whereas you might have thought, well, in the past, in a capitalist workplace, your boss might have told you, you can only take one toilet break, but your boss can't watch you all the time, right? This would be hugely expensive if your boss paid someone just to stare at you and watch what you're doing the whole workday. And so, because of this real-time monitoring and the automated analysis of data, it actually is cost-effective for managers to formulate these very specific, and you might think, these kind of requirements that step over the line of what's appropriate to require of workers. So concerns about this should be set against long-standing concerns about managerial power in capitalist workplaces. So these concerns go back to the kind of early history of industrialization. So there were a lot of workers during industrialization that resisted industrial processes for a number of reasons. But one reason was they didn't want someone directing their behavior in such a fine and detailed way. So why might you be concerned about managerial power? Well, first of all, bosses have this ongoing authority. So when you sign a work contract and you enter a workplace, bosses have the ongoing authority, for example, to set you particular tasks, as well as often the means by which they accomplish them. So they can tell you, you work in an Amazon warehouse, you have to load 25 packages onto the conveyor belt every hour, and here's the procedure by which you have to load the packages. You've got no kind of freedom in how you do it. To determine working conditions, so your boss can decide whether you work on weekends, whether you work 6 days a week, whether how much you might be paid for working overtime, for example. And then finally, your bosses, as well as people higher up in a company, make decisions that impact work tasks as well as working conditions. So for example, they might make and this asymmetric power has these kind of negative further effects that many theories will identify as problematic. But really at the heart of them, what they'll say is, well, these kind of theories, again, that have a long history, that are concerned with these asymmetric exercises of power, can identify what goes wrong here. So the problem is, according to these accounts, the algorithms just give your managers even more power than they had in the first place, and they're liable to use that power to bad ends sometimes. So take the Amazon case, right? What I said before is, before in the past, your manager can't, it wouldn't make sense for them to pay someone to follow you around and watch your every move. So there's a limit in the past to how much power they could exercise over you. It wouldn't make sense for them to issue these detailed requirements like, you can only use the toilet every 3 hours, because they couldn't actually check that, couldn't enforce it. Now, though, because of all this real-time data and this automated analysis, they're able to check it, and so they can exercise more and more power. This is the kind of story, and people have argued this in the literature as well, that we can already give a kind of good account of this. But I want to use a different kind of case, or in the talk I'll use a different set of considerations to motivate that I think these theories that I'll outline later don't fully account for everything that can be wrong about the use of AI in the workplace. So what I want to do is contrast the example of the Amazon warehouse. So recall in the Amazon warehouse, workers had these extremely explicit, fine-grained rules, detailed rules that they had to follow, and then they were monitored based on whether or not they did that. So contrast that with an example like a ride-sharing app like Uber, or like Didi. So take Didi and take the drivers on Didi. So often, at least for many of these ride-sharing apps, how the algorithm actually determines people's work is totally intransparent or opaque to them. So at least it's been studied on Uber that when someone, so you're a driver for Uber, and you just get a little notification that says someone would like to be picked up, there's a new ride, do you accept or not? Doesn't show you any details, so it doesn't show you where the person is going, right? Often doesn't show you how much you're going to earn from doing that. You're just stuck saying yes or no. So the kind of details of your work are often totally opaque to you before you take on a task. And importantly, you might think, often the kind of ways that work is decided upon, is parceled out, is even more opaque than in a traditional company or firm. So drivers on these apps have no idea how it's decided which drivers get which jobs, who gets better jobs, who gets sent somewhere. Whereas you might think, yeah, in the traditional workplace, right, this also happens. We've all had the experience of a coworker who you think is not as good as you, get some kind of good job that you wanted, and you're like, but what's the reason they're not as good as me? But these apps are kind of by design can be so much kind of even less transparent to the people working for them. So in the traditional workplace, there's usually a human manager. You can at least ask for reasons. Often they're required to give them to you, or out of politeness they do. You can ask your fellow workers, right? You're in the same workplace with other people. You can compare with them. This, you're just working for an app. You're driving by yourself. There's no one for you to communicate with. And it's really hard to understand how your work is structured. Second of all, they're often manipulative. So I think an interesting example of a kind of contrast, with the screen is too advanced for me. So an interesting contrast between the Amazon case and the Uber case is that famously for these ride-sharing apps, you are not an employee according to the labor laws of some countries of a company. So in fact, the kind of Uber, the ride-sharing people, can be less coercive in issuing you commands. In fact, it's a kind of relationship where you accept or not, but unlike the Amazon workplace where you're stuck basically doing whatever your boss tells you or being fired, Uber can't make someone drive for an extra 2 hours if they don't want to. They'll just go home. And so these, famously, they actually employ research from behavioral economics in order to design the Uber platform to kind of manipulate or nudge people into doing what the platform wants it to. But again, you don't have these kind of outright commands in the way that you do in the traditional workplace. And finally, interestingly, something sociologists have focused on, that the introduction of these new kind of platforms or markets can actually distribute control. So we said before, look, the kind of traditional liberal political philosophy has a good story about the Amazon case because it's even more so concentrating power into the hand of this one manager that's making you do all these unreasonable things. Here, though, there's control in Uber or Didi is distributed between the designer of the algorithm, you as the individual rider, so you actually have a lot of control, for example, to change where the person is going. So you as the kind of mini employer, the one-off employer, have control over what the person is doing. And I'll try to motivate, because of some weird features about AI, we might want to attribute some kind of quasi-agential control to the platform itself. So interestingly, we see a kind of distribution of control rather than a concentration of control. So as I'll motivate later, I think the reason why these kind of traditional theories aren't able to capture everything, so I do think they capture a lot, right? I think there's a lot of insight you can get from studying relational egalitarian thinking or Republican thinking, but I don't think they can capture everything because, for example, they often concentrate between the kind of relations between individual people and the exercises of power of, one person over another person. And this, I think, again, like AI can kind of increase the ability of an individual manager to exercise this power. But instead, what we ought to be concerned about are these kind of distributed systems of control that it sets up. Often, there's kind of the weird and interesting thing about technology, right? It kind of learns things that we wouldn't expect. It gets deployed and does all of this crazy stuff that we wouldn't expect. And in a way, it kind of gets out of our hands. And I think these are some aspects of it, as well as the kind of insufficient focus on the lack of information and the opacity, which means we need to supplement these two accounts. All right, so 3 main claims for today. So what I'm going to argue is that AI seriously threatens workers' ability to develop an appropriate practical orientation. I'll say later what that means, but it's a concept that comes to us from the work of Hegel via Marx and other kind of Marxist and social philosophy scholars, as well as, interestingly, I think gets picked up in a lot of liberal political philosophy and, for example, the work of John Rawls. Second, this concept of has the potential to introduce radical enough changes that we'll need to do that again, kind of revisit these theories. Okay, so the plan, I'm going to talk about how AI is changing the workplace. This, I think, is just really interesting, so a bit of kind of philosophy of economics, philosophy of social science, about how organizations use information and how the kind of information processing capacities of markets and organization is changing because of AI. Diagnosis, AI threatens subjective freedom. Then motivate that republicanism or relational egalitarianism, these kind of liberal theories I alluded to but didn't explain, can't fully capture the moral complaints. And then again, time permitting, talk a little bit about workplace democracy. All right, the AI-powered workplace. How many of you have experienced a workplace with AI? I mean, right now, I guess, maybe, but how many of you have, say, worked for a company that gave you a device that monitored your keystrokes or monitored your activity? Who has a workplace managed device? No?
I got an experience because, we have a system called e-learning that every student or teacher log in the system can show up how many hours you use the system.
Yeah.
So nobody gets the system to check, I don't know, like readings the teacher sent to you or something communicates with each other. But there is like some time.
Yeah.
There I think the teachers can see students.
Yeah.
And because I got a teacher version, so I'm not sure when the students can compare with each other.
Yeah.
How much time is there.
Yeah.
I think that's fun, right?
Yeah, so I think usually on these platforms, student can't see what each other, how much others use it, but yeah, often the kind of, there's no fancy AI involved, but we all in our work and also our education are being monitored in terms of how much we use certain sites, like how often have you never logged into the e-learning platform for the course that you're taking? Surprise to all of you, someone knows this, and someone could, in principle, do something with this information. So you're, in any workplace in which you find yourself, so some workplaces have really heavy monitoring and evaluation based on data, some have much less, but still you all have and will experience this. So surveillance and AI technologies enable, in many cases, real-time monitoring. So if you were given a work device, they can monitor in real time your keystrokes, use the camera to see whether you're there, what you're looking at, monitor your chats on, say, a workplace forum. Often they enable automated hiring, rating, or firing. So most countries in Western Europe, when they're hiring people, will use an algorithm that automatically scans and rejects resumes. And then the ones that get moved forward often have a human reviewer, but it's only at the final stage that someone actually reviews your resume. They can be used to do adjustments on work tasks in real time. So chatbots often are used. So in many companies in Western Europe, they'll use Slack to communicate, a kind of online messaging platform. The chatbot will monitor the Slack and nudge individuals. Sometimes it's transparent that it's the chatbot, but sometimes it's not. If, for example, a discussion goes on too long, the chatbot will say, hey team, should we wrap this up and move on to something else? And often you don't know that it's a chatbot making this intervention. So adjustments of work tasks in real time paired with this kind of nudging to produce certain behaviors, with a kind of attendant effects on worker well-being and autonomy. And interestingly, so sociology, kind of Western sociology, has tended to focus in on these kind of exercises of managerial power, I think for good reason and for good effect, but often they've forgotten these kind of larger economy-wide questions. And we might want to ask, and this is the kind of thrust of the first section of the presentation, how else is AI changing production? So we've seen, and as I said, there's been a lot of focus on how AI and kind of data gathering technologies can be used for managers to exercise power, but what else is going on? Well, I think at least two things. One, AI is changing how organizations manage information. So by organizations in the capitalist context, I just mean companies, firms. And secondly, we'll see because of the kind of advances in AI, we're able to see a kind of reduction of the use of organizations to manage work. So I think this is really interesting. So if you're kind of an economist in the neoclassical tradition, your default perspective is to start off with markets, and firms look really puzzling, right? So if you're a kind of neoclassical economist, if you're someone in the tradition of Adam Smith onwards, you're going to think markets, amazing, because there are these amazing kind of information aggregation mechanisms that can efficiently match supply and demand. So the great thing about a market is, right, because out of all this buying behavior, if the market is working well, you know, producers will be able to kind of produce enough in order to match buyer demand, and we'll have a fully efficient market. And so markets are wonderful, markets are the default, and any kind of deviation from that is a pure imperfection. And from that perspective, it looks weird that when you look at the economy, it's all these companies. What are all these companies doing there? We're not just selling things directly from an individual producer to an individual buyer via a market. We've organized all of our productive labor under these extremely hierarchical, non-market-based ways to produce. That looks weird. So starting with the work of Frank Knight, famous decision theorist, economist, philosopher of economics, and also in the work of Coase and Hart, two later economists, we see this theme that organizations are important in the economy to enable action in the face of uncertainty. So, we've got, and I'll say more about this in a second, but say that I want to import more coffee to China. There's a lot of uncertainty around this, right? How will demand for coffee change in China? So it seems really big in big cities. Will it be big in rural regions in future? Will people stick to tea? I've got all of this information, but I, as the entrepreneur, it's highly uncertain, right? I can't put kind of precise, well-grounded probabilities on what's going to happen. So I, as the entrepreneur, need to kind of interpret this information. And traditionally, the way that we've done this, and Knight, being a bit of a kind of paternalist or pro-entrepreneur, thought, well, there are a few people who are very good at this. They're the entrepreneurs. They kind of run these companies. Most of us are bad at it. We're the workers. We received a fixed wage in return for not having to manage all of this uncertainty. And it's the kind of, entrepreneurs, the leaders of a company that do this hard task, that set the company strategy. And the organization, the rest of the organization, its kind of task is to have a bureaucratic system in order to manage this uncertainty and produce stuff well. So what we'll want to ask is, how is AI changing how firms manage uncertainty and process this information, and changing markets themselves? Some friends, it just made up some restaurants. It was like, do this thing, which is real, and then go to seafood restaurant, blah, 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 and you look it up and it doesn't exist, right? So we're betting on the technology getting better such that it stops making things up, not something you want from a virtual assistant. But again, right, it's uncertain. You've got to, as an entrepreneur, put some probabilities on future events when you have very little evidence to go on. So how can the entrepreneur, and this has been the subject of a lot of study in economics, right? How can the entrepreneur manage uncertainty? So a kind of traditional answer, right, is, well, we need a kind of specialization. Often we need to kind of go deep on the information that you have. So it's helpful to manage uncertainty. If you're making one product, you can collect a lot of fine-grained information about people's actual behavior for that or related products and kind of do your best. But that only gets you so far. So what Herbert Simon, famous, kind of economist or understander of human behavior of the mid-century, thought was, actually, the way organizations often manage this is standardization and coordination, which is achieved through agreed upon assumptions and specifications, can be more effective than these kind of one-off complicated predictions in a particular scenario. So the way that he thought, so Simon was a big study of what he called bounded rationality. So the fact that human beings have limited computational capacity, we're only so smart. And we only have access to very imperfect information. So how can we kind of do well given our limits in calculation? Well, he thought often actually we do better using these kind of simple heuristics, simple decision-making procedures than doing a very, very complicated prediction that's going to be tailored to each new situation. So, you as an entrepreneur might use a heuristic that's like, if you see a 10% spike in demand in some area for this product, then enter that market, get in there. And of course, this is going to be wrong some of the time, right? But it's still better, Simon thought, to kind of use these standardized procedures than to make these complicated, detailed predictions every time. However, I told you all these great things about AI. I told you about all the wonderful data that AI has, as well as AI being opaque and transparent. Part of why it's intransparent is just these models are really, really complicated. They're way too complicated for us to understand. But an upside of that can be that they're predictively accurate, or more accurate than a human being would be. So I took this mesmerizing little image from Uber's website. So Uber kind of talks about, interestingly, right, we see a lot of kind of scientific or quasi-scientific advances that come through for kind of in industry in order to make money. So one of their advances was precisely an algorithm that was pretty good at matching, at kind of predicting where rider demand will be high in certain areas. So for a certain time of day, where will there be a lot of rides demanded? This is the Bay Area of California. Here's San Francisco. They're predicting, okay, there'll be a lot of demands for people traveling around San Francisco at this time of day, so let's send all of our cars there, right? It's, oh God, who even knows, like an hour to 2 hours to get someone from down here to up here because of traffic. So, you've got to predict demand if you're Uber. You don't want to just rely on like who happens to be driving in an area. You're like, everybody up here, now, or, now, you'll get there in 2 hours. And so this is really important. It's a kind of interesting scientific problem and important for them to make money. And what we see is if we can do very good AI prediction, what it will do is reduce reliance on skilled managerial judgment, or what we saw in the past in, say, operations research, the use of kind of simple linear models that were predictively better than human beings, but still much simpler. So more understandable, better than human beings, but less accurate than what we have now. And so along with changing how organizations themselves manage information, the ability to do these kind of detailed, tailored predictions, we also see how AI is changing labor markets. So we see a kind of increasing hyper-specialization. So in many kind of tasks in the modern economy now, they can be carved up into really, really detailed tasks. So your employees, now there are large language models, and none of you will ever need to write code yourselves again. But in the past, say even a year ago, right, there was a big industry around people actually writing computer code. But now, because it's really easy to transmit and combine information online, I could say, employ Lewis, who's just a specialist in writing this one tiny bit of code, and just be like, do this, 200 times this month for different kinds of applications, and you're just going to do this one thing over and over. Doesn't that sound fulfilling? But in any case, because we have, this hyper-specialization and the low cost of information sharing, first of all, we don't really need to work in teams anymore. I can just carve up all of these tasks, assign one specific task to you, one to you, one to you, one to you, and I just combine it at the end. You don't actually need to work together to do this job. And, as we've been talking about in the Uber case, AI can enable this kind of quick price prediction, and surveillance technologies enable the monitoring of workers. So we see much lower transaction costs to hiring workers via markets for tasks. So in the past, why did we have labor contracts rather than just use markets in order to have people do these one-off tasks? Well, in the past, it was really hard to monitor workers for quality. So you'd hire someone, you weren't quite sure how long it would take them to do something. I think lawyers do this a lot, right? They're like, oh, it'll take me like 10 hours to do that law job. And you're like, it'll be $3,000. And you're like, sure, maybe. So you couldn't, you'd want to hire people in this one-off way, but you couldn't actually monitor them. And it was also hard to kind of monitor and assess the quality of what they would do. But now, again, because all of us can be monitored in real time, it's really easy to check, exactly how much time did it take someone on, say, Mechanical Turk to do a particular task, and then pay them accordingly. So there are much lower costs to setting up these kind of markets for tasks. So how is AI changing production? I think there's a lot more to be said here, but I'm just going to draw out three kind of things that I think are interesting and important for what will come. So first of all, something I've mentioned before, I think we get an increased kind of opacity in production due to these opaque prediction systems. So there's a lot more to be said here, but because these AI models that are very predictively good are often very complex, utilizing maybe like millions or billions of parameters in the model in order to predict something, this means that it's really hard for any individual to scrutinize the model and say exactly why it output what it did. Into that group of pixels more predictively useful for this task, who knows, right? This is not it's not the traditional science process where you identify and you as the scientist clearly define a variable like age. You say how we would measure that variable, you collect data about that variable, and then you build a model on its basis. Instead, the system just gets this unstructured data, just all these pixels, and the system itself is doing the thing that you yourself as a scientist would do, figuring out, okay, what are the predictively relevant variables, and then what's the kind of distribution, the underlying distribution that I can use to predict some fact of interest. So because of that, we might want to say, if we have this kind of activity, I don't want to say they rise to the level of agents like we are, but we've got some kind of like quasi-agential power, or we've got systems that, again, are kind of hard for us to interpret. All right. I want to grab a device so I can monitor how long I've been talking, because if someone is doing it for me, it's not transparent to me that I'm being monitored. OK. Excellent. So what I think we need, and what I'll kind of sketch for you in the remainder of the talk, is we need an account that can take account of changes in the economy that's kind of at the intersection of epistemology and ethics. So we care about, how increased opacity might be bad for workers, how these distributed systems of control could be bad, or how the kind of systems taking their life on their own could be bad. And part of what we need to understand is how they manage and use information. All right. So we'll talk a little bit about subjective freedom at work, and then I'll sketch why I think this is a better account than these two alternatives, and then I'll close, and you can ask me about democracy in the tea break if you're curious, maybe. All right. So why, or what is one kind of complaint that I think we can make against the introduction of AI in the workplace? So it's worth saying, right, I think I'm not saying that, uses of AI are always good or bad, that there's some kind of deterministic way in which this will go. But I think it's helpful to understand the complaints that workers could have if it were used in certain ways in order for us as a society to kind of do this well, to deploy AI well in the economy. So I think that AI seriously threatens what I'll call workers' ability to develop an appropriate practical orientation. So what is that? Don't worry, you've all got one, according to Hegel. So I'm just going to explain to you what it is, but you're already familiar with it, fortunately. So this is a concept that we, as I said, we find in the work of Hegel. It's important in the work of Marx and following Marxians, but also in the work of liberals like John Rawls. So the idea, I think, driving it is, it wouldn't be a kind of perfectly good society if we had, a powerful leader who always made the right moral decision, but you never knew why the moral decision was made. So even though there would be these kind of good outcomes, justice would be achieved, we'd had this kind of flourishing welfare, because you yourself wouldn't understand kind of the moral principles by which your society was set up, there'd still be something missing. So in the terms of Rawls, you need to be kind of reconciled or at home in your society in this important way. They thought actually kind of political philosophy could help us do this, could help us understand when our society is good and bad, and to either be reconciled or not to it. So what is this practical orientation? It's a reflective attitude you take towards your social world that inspires a kind of way of acting in the world that you don't need to reflectively articulate. So I said you all had one. Probably wasn't transparent to you that you did, but that's okay. It's a sort of attitude for which there's a right kind of reason. So I'm assuming that there are kind of principles by which we can judge societies as better or worse. We may not know them, we may imperfectly know them, but still if you live in, Nazi Germany, and you're like, thumbs up, we're doing great, this society is great. You've made a mistake. You've got the wrong kind of practical orientation. It's a practical attitude, so it motivates you to do stuff. And importantly, it's deeply social. So it's formed kind of in communication with others in your social position, and it's usually shared by a group. So example, I think, here is very helpful. So say that you're a university professor. So university professors, I want to say, enact the role of being a professor in light of some often implicit attitudes they have towards the function the university plays in their society. So say that you live in a society, I'll just take the United States as an example, where education upholds unjust class structures. If you go to a prestigious university, you're going to get a high-paying job. You're going to kind of have much more income and wealth than other people. Often you got into that fancy university because your parents could pay for private tutoring, or indeed because they went to that fancy university, and that was a selection criterion. Okay, so how should professors in this kind of society feel and act in their workplace? Well, arguably, the moral character of their society, right, licenses, makes appropriate attitudes such as a kind of opposition to this function that the university plays. It probably plays other functions, right, like educating young people, plays good functions, but this particular function should license some kind of opposition and say attendant actions in light of that attitude. So if you're a university professor, maybe actually this attitude influences where you want to work. Maybe it influences the kind of activities that you do. Say that maybe you spend a bunch of time going to under-resourced schools, giving presentations about the university, how people can attend, how the application process works, so on and so forth. Contrast that with a society where the educational system promotes a kind of equality of opportunity or some desirable value, right? It's a meritocracy, or it does the thing that we think education ought to do. In that case, it licenses attitudes such as endorsement, approval, and actions to support the functioning of the university to kind of keep this good thing going. So when people think about workplaces and how they make you unfree, there's a tendency, I think, to focus on what we can call objective, following Hegel, kind of objective freedom, or conceptions of freedom that are really concerned with how you're constrained and your actions are kind of narrowed in the workplace. Why is that? Well, I think often for a very good reason, right? It's a very serious complaint if you're, you enter a country for work, but your employer takes your passport and is like, now you can't leave the country unless you do all this work for me. You've got one option, right? This is a really, really serious complaint. This is an objection. Is AI so threatening? Well, in many cases, and you might just disagree with this, I've tried to motivate for you that AI can make the workplace and the economy even more opaque to people. So because AI can automatically gather data about us, these sensors can automatically gather data without us even knowing. AI systems can be used to analyze those data, produce kind of, analyses based on reasons that we can't even access. And those are used to make judgments about, say, whether you're hired, fired, promoted in the workplace. The workplace can be even more opaque to workers. It's even harder to get access to information about why decisions are being made. Second thing, I think, again, if you bought my story about the facial recognition using representations that are hard for us to understand, I think the fact that these systems kind of learn models in a way that's hard for us to understand how they get there can make them less intelligible to agents. So even if you had full transparency, even if someone was like, yeah, sure, have the model, have all the data it was trained on, run a bunch of inputs through the model, see what you get, it still might not be understandable to you in an important kind of way. And finally, as I motivated earlier, what concerns us, I think, is not the exercise, the kind of traditional concern about having a bad boss. So a lot of political philosophy thinking about the economy was concerned with bad bosses, somebody who's given all this authority over you, right, and exercised it for bad reasons. Someone who was like, you're not getting promoted because I don't like the ethnic group you belong to. These kind of like horrible discriminatory exercises of power by an individual are very concerning, but they're not what we're concerned about with AI. And indeed, you might think, hey, actually, from this perspective of concentration of power, AI could potentially be a good thing because it can distribute power in the economy between different kinds of agents. So this is why I think this kind of, because there are all these epistemic dimensions to the concerns that workers have, it's why I think that this idea of a subjective, a practical orientation is helpful for us to think through these problems. All right, I think what I might do is say the kind of upshot and then close and see if there are any questions. And then if we have time, we can talk a little bit about these alternative accounts, but I'm happy to share the PowerPoint and kind of follow up over tea. So I think the lesson that I would want to take away from this is both a kind of lesson in political philosophy, but also one in philosophy of social science. So the philosophy of social science lesson, which I think is super interesting, and I haven't seen much work on this, so please correct me and send me stuff, is that there are really interesting questions about how different kinds of different kinds of mechanisms in the economy can aggregate information, can kind of make information available in a form that can be usable by economic agents. So how organizations can manage uncertainty in order to make decisions, how markets aggregate information in order to help people act. So the great thing about markets, right, people just do stuff. And if the market is working well, it aggregates, it takes all this information about people just buying stuff, and it encodes it into a price. And you actually need to understand very little as an entrepreneur about what is happening in the economy to look at this price and say, okay, that's kind of how much the average person would be willing to pay for this thing. I can use that just as a kind of signal of what to do. And so if AI systems are able to kind of help us or, make it possible to organize more of our economic activity in terms of markets, they might have this interesting kind of information aggregation function that this market can kind of, give us these signals about what to do, even though we're not really sure kind of like the grounds for those signals. And secondly, there's that kind of information management component, these philosophy of science questions, and then there are all the moral and political questions that we'll want to ask on top of that. So given that we think that AI could make the workplace even more opaque to workers, why is this a bad thing? And is it only bad if it kind of allows someone to exercise power over someone else? I think the answer is no. I think it's bad because, in a sense, even if your workplace is a good one, right? Even if you live in the kind of just perfect society where someone is making good decisions, it's still important that you yourself be able to make up your own mind about your role, your job, and why it's good or bad. And so I think that's why you'd have this kind of moral complaint, even if things were going well. So I think there's also a kind of need to theorize, do some moral theorizing about how AI is changing the economy that, again, looks beyond just how managers are using it to exercise power. All right, with that, I'll stop. I don't want to go over too much, but thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions.